Someone's got their phone near their microphone, so I can hear the signal there.
So I see that people are still joining, but I suggest that we start if it's okay for you all. Welcome to this remake session of an event that we had this morning in Europe on the next steps on developing the UN sustainability indicators with the ranking agencies. So we ran these two events so that we can accommodate you all with the different time differences. This is part one, with Times Higher Education. We'll have the pleasure of welcoming Duncan from Times Higher Education in a minute. And there will be a second part, obviously after part one, there's part two with the QS next Wednesday on the same topic. So welcome to you all. My name is Alexander. I work as an institutional data manager at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, EPFL, in Switzerland. And I will be one of your two moderators today with Christina.
Yes. Thank you so much, Alexander. My name is Christina von Oelreich, and I'm working as the Sustainability Manager at KTH in Stockholm. And I'm really looking forward to this meeting and have a good and great discussions together with you.
Thank you. So maybe a forward on Zoom functionalities. Please, you will see a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. I think hopefully you're all acquainted with this. Please ask your question through that option, since you will not have the opportunity to speak your question out, but rather ask it, type your question in the Q&A box, and you will have the opportunity to vote for questions so that we can prioritize the questions that we will address to Duncan later. We would suggest you to use the side-by-side mode option so that the event is more comfortable for you all. The program, so after this quick intro, we'll have the pleasure of listening to Duncan Ross for 20 minutes. So we have prepared a few questions to address him, mainly the questions that we have all gathered from you, the audience, from the working group, the ISCN working group, but also from the network CESA, which is the network of the Universities of Science and Technology in Europe. So we have roughly 10 questions and we will really use a kind of a discussion format here with the questions with Duncan. Then we'll open the floor, we'll take your questions in a Q&A session, and then we'll conclude with a 5-minute conclusion, and next step, this will be done by Christina. So Duncan Ross, thank you very much for joining us. You are the Chief Data Officer at Times Higher Education and one, if not the founder of the creator of the Times Impact Ranking. Thank you very much for joining us today for the second time. Thank you. And so this event is a follow-up of an event that we held at the end of June, where we ran a survey among 30 universities, and results were presented during an event, and a lot of questions were raised during that event. And today we are going to be very specific. It's not going to be a general event. We're going to be very specific. We really want Duncan to share with us his perspective on future development, methodology, Christina, maybe if you'd like to ask the first question to Duncan.
Yes, thank you so much, Alexander. We will go straight to the questions then. And the first question is, how does Times Higher Education Impact Ranking plan to lower the burden of data submission, address the aggressive also deadline for data submission that we have this year, and increase the possibilities to using the same data. We have seen that this is a question that is very important, and a lot of universities are, of course, thinking about this if they are going to attend the ranking or not. So please, Duncan.
Well, thank you for the question, Christina, and thank you to ISCN for inviting me to answer these. Also for the second time today, so I need to try and pretend I haven't seen the questions in advance and that this is much more spontaneous than it really is. But it's a good question, and I'd like to think about this in three ways. The first one is to say that we're very aware of the difficulty and the technical challenge of gathering the data on behalf of universities, and we do appreciate the work that universities do to try and gather the data. Right from the start, we've been aware of this, and we've tried to design the methodology in a way that allows universities to participate with as limited an amount of data gathering as is possible. So, for example, you can just submit data around one SDG. That will get you visibility. To be in the overall ranking, we ask universities to provide data for SDG 17 and three other SDGs. So there is that opportunity for universities to choose which SDGs they think they want to take the time and effort to prepare data for. And we have brought the data submission deadline forward this year. And again, this is something that has come about because of the nature of the kind of data that we're looking at. For many of our rankings, such as the World University Ranking, we're looking at numeric data, and it's a lot easier for us to evaluate that. We can do quantitative measures to assess consistency, assess quality, and so on. Here with the impact ranking, though, we're also asking for evidence of what universities have done, and that requires us to take the time to review that evidence and to understand that, and to make sure that we are assessing it fairly and appropriately. Now, to do that, we bring in additional people onto my team, people with specific language skills, people with understanding of different contexts, but that does take more time. So what did we do this year to try and ameliorate for that? The first thing we did is we published the methodology for the ranking in much more detail than previous years, and we published it before we even opened the data collection portal. So that was made available much earlier, hopefully to give universities more time to think about the data that they might want to choose to submit and what kind of things they need to collect. But we've also tried to significantly enhance the actual data submission portal. We put a lot of work into trying to make that easier to use. That obviously helps us actually in the long run, because if you have fewer problems, you don't complain to us about the problems. And that includes the ability to copy information from last year's submission. So if you've submitted data and examples from last year, you can now copy them into this year's submission, which we hope makes life considerably easier, particularly for pieces of evidence such as policies where the evidence itself probably may not have changed over that time period.
Thank you, Duncan. I confirm that you provide the same answer as this morning. You've passed this first test. Thank you very much. Second question about data accessibility. I think we're almost 40 in the virtual room now, and many people had the same question. And the second question is, should more publicly available data be used? Does THE plan to build a platform for sharing part or full of their raw data for free, for benchmarking purposes, and really as an incentive for more universities to participate in the future?
So I think these are two quite distinct questions. Should more public data be used? If there was more public data, I would be delighted to use it. The reality is that data on particularly on all aspects of higher education, to be honest, but especially around sustainability, is not generally available in a consistent fashion across the world. And one of the things that this ranking is trying to be is a truly global look at the work that universities are doing. Where that data becomes available, I will definitely look into seeing how it can be used. But in terms of the other aspect, which is then what do we do about sharing data? Well, the first thing we do is, of course, and this is part of our methodology, is we recognize and give extra credit for when the evidence that universities are submitting is in the public domain. And we actively encourage universities to record things about the sustainability work that they're doing. So hopefully we're pushing for universities themselves to put this in the public domain. This, I think, is the first route to making sure this information, this insight is available. And we have made a deliberate decision about our business model for this. So other organisations such as ASHI, who produce the STARS assessment, charge an upfront fee for participation. We've very deliberately decided not to do that as a mechanism of increasing the availability of participation. Our business model is then to charge universities if they wish to access some of the more detailed benchmarking data at the back end. Having said that, I do think there is scope for us to see what else we can put into the public domain. I think there's a particular case around some of the evidence that's presented, not because it can't necessarily be found elsewhere, but simply because trying to search for that is not necessarily straightforward. Even within the data we've collected, it's not straightforward to search for a particular example of evidence. And I'll give you a brief anecdote about a question we were asked by a researcher from one of the Australian universities. And he said, I'm interested in evidence that's been submitted by universities about the sustainability that uses as an example the First Nations, whether those are the Native Americans, whether that's Aboriginals, whether that's Torres Island Straits people or Maori, whoever it is. Can you give us examples of that? Now, actually, that's a really difficult question to answer because it requires us to be able to search across a set of documents. And that's something I'd like to think about. Can we find a way of providing that search functionality which would make that much more open and accessible in a way that even on the web, even when these are public documents, it's not necessarily easy to find them at the moment.
Thank you so much, Duncan. And then we have another questions. And I think this is also the questions that we have seen a lot of universities really are thinking about. And we also understand that this is a complex issue. The question is, are there any measures taken for addressing the problem of context-specific issues like drinkable water, teacher training, clean water and sanitation, energy policies that depend very much on a national environment, so that the ranking focuses on measuring actions to take by universities?
No, it is a great question, and one of the difficulties of any international assessment, whether it's a ranking or anything else, is how to deal with the very different contexts that are in play in different countries. Now, one of the things that we were very keen on in this particular ranking was to move away from an assessment that would always benefit the wealthier parts of the world, and particularly those universities who had more resources than others. And so some of the questions we're asking are deliberately slanted in a way that will work to more towards what I would call equity than necessarily strict equality. And now, we don't guarantee that we've got, in fact, I will be blunt about this. I don't think we've got it right in every single case with every single question. And we do deeply appreciate when universities come back to us and say, actually, how do I interpret this in my context? It's not the case that this doesn't work in quite that way in this country. Now, why do I want universities to do that? Firstly, because we don't see the impact rankings themselves like an exam. We're not going to lock you in a room and say, provide all your data, you're not allowed to talk to anyone else. We actually encourage universities to talk to us about the data they're submitting. It's in our interest and the university's interest to ensure that the data that is submitted is as accurate as possible and as consistent as possible with what everyone else is doing. And when universities contact us, that enables us to build up a stronger set of evidence of frequently asked questions, so we can put that into the guidance. And it helps us to understand when we've misunderstood something. So we will look to try and interpret things in specific local contexts and give universities ways of understanding what we're aiming at. But there will be times when we measure things where a university may not have complete control over something, but where what they are doing still has an impact. And I'll use the example that I think I used from this morning. We had an Australian university who said it's not fair for you to assess how carbon neutral we are because we have to buy energy from a very carbon heavy national grid system. And two things to say about that. The first one is I wish universities were more proactive in terms of their lobbying powers. Universities can have a huge impact on their governments if they choose to do so. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that regardless of whether the university itself could have a direct impact on that, it nevertheless would be generating more carbon as a result of their actions. And so they are having an impact on the world, a negative impact on the world, because of the situation they're in.
And the following question is a bit of a follow-up to what you've already responded in terms of the complexity of comparing different environments, different universities. But question 4 is, some universities have found difficult to deliver data in some of the metrics due to the national frameworks and rules. So how should THE take this into account? You've just provided an answer. Would you like to expand on that?
Certainly, I think that this also points in a slightly different direction, because the description of frameworks and rules speaks to something that we do see fairly frequently, which is that a university will say, we don't have a policy on X because it's already the law. Now, there are a few exceptions where we actually look at the nature of the law and say, actually, that makes perfect sense. But in most cases, when we're talking about policy, perhaps we're being too specific when we say policy, and we should actually rather talk about guidelines and frameworks for behaviour. But policy is a good shorthand for that. So, for example, when you have a government that sets a policy about pay equity, gender pay equity, and pretty much every government in the world has some variation on a law around gender pay equity. Firstly, the government rarely says explicitly how each individual institution in the country should interpret that. And it certainly doesn't put in place the mechanisms by which those decisions could be challenged or tested, or remedies could be put in place. It's usually down to the university or the organisation to have those. And so it may be that in some circumstances, it's not saying explicitly we have a policy, but we do have a practice that we follow to ensure that we are addressing the legal situation appropriately. But above all, I'll come back to the answer from the previous question. Talk to us about this. Help us to explain to understand your local context, and then we can give you guidance about how best to answer that question within that particular scenario.
Thank you, Duncan.
Yes, thank you so much, Duncan. And here we have the next questions, and I think they want you to run a 5-minute presentation of the future changes that you plan to implement in their methodology. I think you can open, maybe not 5 minutes, but the time you think is necessary, of course. So
I don't think I've ever been able to talk for anything for just 5 minutes. But you can ask my ex-wife about that as well. Yes, I mean, we do want to be clearer about the direction that the ranking is going. And we have described the changes that are in place for this year elsewhere, so I'll not go into those for now. We don't currently have any concrete plans for changes for future years, other than to say that one of the things we want to bring in order to make those changes more consistent and more open, is that we're going to bring into play an advisory board. So I'll be actively recruiting for members to join that advisory board, and they will be able to direct us in terms of future methodology changes. And they will be able to do that, by the way, we won't limit what they're able to look at. They will be able to make decisions about the way they think we should be going, however they choose. Now, having said that, it's still our ranking. We are still responsible. It may be that there are situations where the advisory board say you should do this, and we say, well, we don't think we can or should do that. But in those circumstances, I would expect the advisory board to make very public the disagreement, and it would be down to us to justify why we weren't agreeing with them. But that's certainly the plan. And I also hope that the advisory board can be a diverse board, not just in terms of the individuals on the board, but also in terms of the institutions and the organisations they represent. I think it's crucially important, particularly when we think about sustainability, that we do ensure that there is representation from universities in the lower and low middle income countries, that we don't just go back to the usual suspects, as it were. So that's something that we're going to be working on, and we hope to be able to announce the new board at the Innovation and Impact Summit in April, which may or may not be a physical summit.
Thank you so much. I also remember when they had the meeting in the morning that you also were talking about moving from input to output. I think that was really interesting to hear you talk about.
No, that's a great point. And sorry, Christina, that I'm not as consistent as I'd hoped to be. Perhaps not enough coffee in the afternoon. Yeah, so this is a really interesting point, and it's something One of my side tasks as part of this has been working with the United Nations Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, looking at how we could create a set of guidelines for assessment organisations to help them ensure that if they're doing work like this, they do it in a consistent way and that they are following best practice. One of the clear things that is important as part of that is this idea that there is a difference between measuring inputs, measuring outputs, and measuring outcomes. And it's an area which is challenging throughout the social sector. What usually gets measured is inputs because that's relatively easy to measure. Secondly, what tends to get measured is outputs. So in the case of a university, for example, that might be the number of students you've taught. That would be a great example of an output. But what would be really useful is, of course, the outcome. So if you're, again, thinking about that concrete example, if we said, how does your university teach sustainability? The inputs might be, yes, we have a policy in place or we have teachers to do it. The outputs might be we taught 5,000 lessons or 5,000 hours of material, but the outcomes would be whether or not the students took those lessons into their future lives and demonstrated the effect of that. Now, in the ranking at the moment, I will admit that we have too many things that are measuring inputs or outputs and not enough things that are measuring outcomes. Partly that's because outcomes are harder to measure, and partly it's because we need to make sure that at least the inputs and the outputs are there first. And as time goes by, I hope we will shift away from those questions around inputs and outputs much more towards trying to assess outcomes, even though that is a much more difficult task.
And this goes back to a comment that we've heard a lot with Christina, which is performance does not necessarily mean impact. And this is something that is also interesting to explore. And it's good to hear that THE has plans to explore outcomes. Ranking exercises are often seen as a very quantitative exercise, number crunching and things that are in a way summable. And the next question maybe goes along those lines, is to what extent do you, THE, plan to change the policy-based evidence that is seen, at least, as hard to quantify? And along those lines, what is the definition of policy-based evidence? How do you define having a policy? Will you or provide all the evidence that you collect public so that maybe there are best practices that can be drawn out of that?
So we talked a little bit about some of the nature of policy in a previous question, so I'll not dwell on that too much. But you're right that this is a shift away from much more quantitative or continuous variables. So the number of students you have is, it's a continuous variable that ranges from, probably the low hundreds up to 300,000 for some of the big Turkish universities. But we thought in this particular ranking, when we were looking at what universities were doing, that we needed to also have much more qualitatively based assessment. Now, we don't think we've got the resources. We certainly don't understand the context well enough to do a very full qualitative assessment. What we're doing instead is this combination. We take qualitative inputs, such as policy, and we convert that into a quantitative approach through what we hope is a consistent approach. So typically the first thing we ask is, do you do something or do you have a policy? And when you say yes, because we trust universities, we give you credit for that. You get a point for that. We then look at the evidence that's been submitted, and that could, for example, be a policy document or a practice that shows you how you would implement a particular law. And then if we think that accurately reflects the question that's been asked, we'll give you another point. We will then say, is this public or not? Because that's that big emphasis on, are you holding yourselves accountable to us partly, but much more importantly to the general public? And policies are a great example of this, by the way. Often policies are held internally. But if you only hold a policy internally, if you don't show the world what you're doing and what the rules are, it's very hard for you to be challenged on that. Think about all of the controversy isn't the right word. Think of the awareness that's been made around the world in the last couple of years, firstly with the Me Too movement and secondly with the Black Lives Matters movement. If we claim that we have a policy to address the progress of women or the progress of of black Americans, for example, in our university, but we won't tell you what that policy is, then that means that we're not holding ourselves accountable for that. If we put the policy in the public domain, then people can actually say, well, actually, are you living up to that? You say you're going to promote equally, but I look at your count of women professors and it seems to be much lower than it should be. So that is a really important thing, that idea of visibility and accountability. And that then, Alexander, flows into your next question. You know, can we do more to make that visible so that then people can take best practice? At the moment, that's very difficult because you'd have to work backwards through the SDGs to the questions, then to the policies to actually discover the ones that are most relevant to you. But I do think there's further work we can do in that area.
Thank you, Duncan. The next question comes from our friends from the CESA network.
Yes, thank you so much again. The question is why not measuring the scientific performance along the 6 transformations as defined by ISCN, for example, education, gender, inequality, health, well-being, and so on. I think this is another way or another method also trying to measure how you're working according to the sustainability goals. What are your thoughts about this?
So, I mean, the first thing I would say to this is that I wholeheartedly support any university that wants to measure itself against the sustainable development goals in whatever way makes most sense for that university. And if you decide that actually the right way isn't to participate in our ranking, I don't really mind if you're actually measuring. That's the most important thing. Now, as to whether or not you should group the SDGs, that in itself is a fairly controversial position, and it's not one that is necessarily shared throughout all parts of the United Nations, which is such a large and complex organisation that it almost never agrees about everything. Grouping the SDGs together like this seems to me to be slightly contra to the actual development of the SDGs themselves. Remember, they grew out of the Millennial Development Goals, which had a much narrower focus. And there was a lot of work done to allow the expansion to take into account things like gender equity and broader inequalities and development and so on. And I think that actually standing each SDG by itself is actually something that is valuable. It allows universities to choose which SDGs they think are most relevant to their work. And we've seen this in the submissions that we've seen from universities. So when we look, for example, at Latin America, we see that in Latin America, a lot of universities choose to submit data around SDG 16, which is peace, justice and strong institutions, SDG 4, which is quality education, and SDGs 1 and 2, which are no poverty and zero hunger. You know, those are 4 SDGs that don't group neatly into one of these categories, but they see the links between those. How can you have peace, justice and strong institutions if you don't also address issues of poverty and hunger? So and this, I think, is one of the fundamental factors of the SDGs, is that you can treat them individually, but actually they all interlink in different ways. So I don't have a real problem with the idea of doing things along these six transformations. I think we were right to choose to stick to the 17 individual SDGs in this instance. But how you as a university choose to do that, you know, in terms of the bigger picture, that I think is down to you and what makes most sense for your institution.
Duncan, maybe since you can observe different patterns from different parts of the world in terms of responding to those SDGs, and you gave us the example of South America, Europe, or Asia focusing on different SDGs. Does it make sense still to have an overall ranking in the end, or should we in the end acknowledge the fact that the world is different, parts of the world are different, universities themselves within the same part of the world are different, and in that sense maybe have a narrower focus on the 17 rankings in a way? So, sorry, this is not part of the question here, but
it's great. It's making me think on my feet, Alexander, and that's really important, especially at this time of day. So I think in the longer term, actually, there's a lot of merit to that. I think in the longer term, what we might end up seeing is that we end up breaking this ranking down, and we have, we do one version for Latin America, another version for Europe, and so on, where we will see greater consistency. But there is an important reason why we wanted to do this as an overall ranking, even though it's resulted in a much more complex methodology than we usually see. And that is that, and this goes, I think, a little bit to the debate that was had at the last meeting, which is, frankly, if you don't believe in rankings, then this ranking isn't a good thing for you. If your university fundamentally thinks rankings are the devil's work, okay, that's a position. It's not one I agree with, but I totally accept that that's a position that people take. But what we do know about rankings is that they do drive visibility for actions that other routes find harder to get. Now, that may not be for particularly good reasons, but it is absolutely the case. If I produce a list of universities and say I'm doing a ranking about impact, it raises the visibility to the general public and, interestingly, within universities. Now, obviously, this is the ISCN. This is a group of universities who already have committed leadership around sustainability. But there are some universities out there where the sustainability actions are taking place, but they're not highly visible to the leadership of the organisation. That they aren't seen as a strategic priority. Rankings are a way of actually making it a strategic priority for the organisation. And you know, if I have a tool and I can use it to drive sustainability forward, I'm going to do that, even if it doesn't necessarily always align with all the things I'd like to achieve.
Thanks, Duncan. And the next question is about your collaboration with Elsevier as of identifying keywords in the bibliometric study that you use in the ranking. So maybe the question is a long one here, but in a nutshell is, will universities with more mean maybe bias the use of words in their research papers? I mean, is it equal in some ways, and is it a good way of assessing research done for as per the SDGs in a way?
So this is something, well, the short answer is yes, we can absolutely do a presentation on this. In fact, this is something that came out of our discussion this morning. We will arrange for Elsevier to talk to ISCN about their methodology, about their approach, and about where they hope it's going to go in the future. They are coordinating their work with the Aurora network, which is a network largely of European universities who are trying to address the same problem in a very similar way. They had come with a slightly different set of keywords, but now the two groups are working together to try and create a set of keywords which are both open, so they can be assessed and challenged by everyone. It's a form of open science, but also one that hopefully reasonably accurately reflects research around each of the SDGs. I say reasonably accurately because keyword searches always have a problem. You always get false positives and false negatives, so type 1 and type 2 errors when you take this kind of approach. I think there are also some really genuine questions about the bibliometric data sets and non-English language material. I think that's a real issue. But I think we should commend Elsevier for being willing to work in this area and also from open sourcing the outputs from it. There are also some interesting technical decisions that need to be made in the near future. The keyword search approach, I think, is good because it is very visible. It's very easy to understand how it works. As you said, Alexander, then there's the danger of, could it be gamed? An alternative approach is to use a machine learning or AI-based approach where you effectively learn to detect which papers are associated with which SDGs. The downside of that, of course, is that you lose the transparency. It becomes much more difficult to understand why you get to the set of documents that you do. So I think there's probably a balance to be had there, but that's a decision that we need to think about in the future, not just in terms of how we use this, but actually how we can interpret research around the Sustainable Development Goals in a broader sense.
Thank you, Duncan. And maybe expanding with Elsevier is indeed a good idea. Christina, maybe the last question.
Yes. The last question is then if you have some thoughts on normalization of scores by size. At the moment, we understand that you used a C-score approach for the 2019 impact ranking, but it not normalized by institutional size.
So we do try and normalize most of our metrics by institutional size in one way or another. So, for example, when we look at first-generation students, we look at the proportion of first-generation students. When we look at energy usage, we look at energy usage in terms of the total floor area of the university. So these are scaled by the size of the institution. And the aim is definitely to end up with a situation where a large university doesn't have an advantage over a small university or vice versa. Now, obviously, for the evidence-based questions, it's not really possible to normalize a policy. That would be an interesting mathematical problem to try and deal with. And I'm always open to novel approaches, but in those cases, we don't need to take quite the same approach. So we are trying to recognize the difference in sizes of a university, the difference in scopes of universities. This year, also for the first time, we're asking universities, and this is something we've developed having talked to our friends at ASHE who run the STAR system. So we're also asking universities about the perimeter of their organization that they are including in the rankings. That helps us to understand what's being included and excluded, but it also gives us greater insight for future years about the way we need to normalize and the way we need to account for the very different scopes of universities. So in Europe, for example, we're very familiar with the idea of campus-based institutions which are quite tightly focused in a single location. In the United States, we have state universities who may have multiple campuses and many extensions which are very different types of organization. And trying to build out a ranking in a way that is fair and equitable across all those different models is something that we continue to work towards.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I think we can move to the second part of the event, which is we're going to open up to the questions from the audience. Please do not hesitate to ask your questions. We already have 2 questions here. Christina, would you like to take the first question, maybe?
Thank you.
You're on mute now, Christina.
Okay, I will take this question, and as it's come from KTH, it's Erica Donegan. Thank you so much for sending this question because we have discussed it. I recognize it. The question is, travel is a key part of academic life, and the carbon emissions associated with it are high. Reducing flights within the sector would make significant contribution to meeting the goal 12. The metrics and the indicators for goal 12 should include measures to reduce air travel and support sustainable meeting conferences like an alternatives. So that was the question.
So that sounds more like a statement than a question, and it's. I talk to academics a lot, so I'm quite familiar with this. But actually, it's a really good point. There will always be some things we haven't actually started to measure yet, or we haven't decided to measure yet. I think that's an interesting one. I'm not certain whether I would put that in 12 or 13. It could well be put in climate action rather than sustainable consumption and production. And to an extent, we're starting to explore that in SDG 13. So last year, we asked universities about their commitment to carbon neutrality, but we were very open about how that was defined. This year, we're being more explicit, and we're asking universities to state whether they are defining carbon neutrality in terms of the scope, the 3 scopes of carbon neutrality that are often talked about. So scope 1, scopes 1 and 2, scopes 1, 2 and 3. And certainly if you looked at scope 3, that explicitly includes things like travel to conferences and so on. So I think that actually there is definitely scope for expanding how we explore that in the future. I do think there is obviously an interesting tension there about how do you ensure that a university is able to maintain the links and the linkages that are so important and emphasized in partnerships for the goals, and yet minimize the amount of damage done to the environment through things like excessive flights and so on. So I think it's a really interesting area, and certainly one that I'd like to look at in the future.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'd like to address a question that I received just before the beginning of the event, and I'm going to link this question to the question that David is asking on the chat. But the first part of the question is, why are major universities not did not participate in THE Impact Ranking? And maybe as a follow-up question, is THE planning to include sustainability into the World University 4.0 edition as a way maybe also to include more universities in the future?
So, well, I'd say that a number of different ways I can address that question. I think, firstly, MIT is a reasonably major university and they participated. So, I'm willing to say that there are some fairly big universities. KTH are a major university and they chose to participate. So I'm not going to say that none of the big universities or the ones that are perceived as being the top universities in the world participated. But obviously I would like more to choose to participate. Why don't they? Well, sometimes it is simply because if you're already top of the list, so if you're the University of Oxford and you're #1 in the world university ranking and you've been there for the last 4 years, joining a new ranking and you're not certain how you're going to appear in it is a risk. It's a reputational risk. You may not come top. And there's no particular reason why we would expect the universities that come top of a research-intensive ranking to necessarily do as well in a ranking that was looking at sustainability. So there is a clear issue there. I was very pleased by the approach taken by MIT, who said, actually, we acknowledge that we may not do as well in this as we do in other rankings, but actually it's still important to us to actually assess ourselves in terms of sustainability. So that's one part of it. And it is, as we've hinted at earlier, a commitment in terms of time and effort. Particularly in the United States, where there are hundreds of rankings generated every year, universities need to be very rational about their decisions about where they're going to put their effort. Having said that, I expect we'll grow this significantly this year. I'm not going to give you any expected numbers because that's just that would just be a foolish decision on my part to say that. But we had 860 universities participating last year, and I'm sure we will have many more participating this year, which is a good thing in terms of the visibility of sustainability, even if you don't agree with rankings.
That's what our survey, the survey we ran at the beginning of the year, showed as well. So
absolutely, and some of the areas where pressure is coming from is quite interesting as well. So Penn State participated last year for the first time. And one of the odd benefits or the unexpected benefits they saw from it is that the first people to comment on this were their alumni. Their alumni started contacting them and saying, look, it's really great to see that Penn State is committed to this. And they've now taken that out to the rest of the Big Ten conference, and hopefully we'll get some of them on board this year. Should we include sustainability as part of the World University Rankings? Well, I'm in two minds about this. The first question is, of course, how would we do that? How would we distill down what is already, and I think there have been some genuine arguments about this. People have said, well, how can you hope to measure something that's as broad as sustainability and bring it down to a single metric and a single ranking? And we've tried to do that in a way which is complex, I agree, but actually gives a very broad base for that. How would we distill that down to a single measurement that we would put, or a small number of measurements that would go into the World University Rankings? And I think then there's also the question about what is the focus of that ranking. That ranking focuses very much on a traditional research-intensive view of what universities are. And I don't know how at the moment we would fit in with that. Now, what I had hoped to do this year, but COVID-19 meant that we were facing some unexpected pressures, is to put an indicator alongside universities' position in the World University Ranking that showed when they were also choosing to participate in the impact ranking, and use this as a way of effectively allowing more visibility for participants that I would hope would again encourage more of the universities that do well in that research-focused ranking to participate in the impact ranking. Sorry, this is the kind of thing that we have long, detailed discussions about within Times Higher Education, and so I tend to go on about it far too long.
Thank you, Duncan.
So much. Yes, and then we have also a question from Sylvia. How do you consider the fact that universities might excel on the 4 SDGs they choose to report on, while actually doing terrible out of 4 other SDGs? What would be your safeguard against such selective reporting?
Well, firstly, because of the interconnected nature of the SDGs, I think that hopefully that would be quite difficult to do. You wouldn't imagine that a university would be able to do well at SDG 10, but do terribly at SDG 5 because of the interconnected relationship with that. But there is a suggestion that in the longer term, we look at expanding the minimum number of SDGs that are part of the process. The other thing I would say, of course, is that SDG 17, the one that we ask all universities who want to be in the overall ranking to submit to, There we explicitly look at research across all the SDGs, and we also look at whether or not universities are publishing their progress around each individual SDG. So if a university was deliberately not exposing data, not showing what they were doing in anywhere other than the 4 SDGs they chose to submit, well, 3 of the SDGs they chose to submit, it would, I hope, be visible in SDG 17. So there is some degree of safeguarding there. I do hope, as I say, as time goes by, I would like to expand the number of SDGs that are the minimum. The reason we don't do that right now is because of the burden that would put on universities which had lower levels of resources to submit data. And I think there's a tension there. If we exclude universities because they're not from the wealthy part of the world, they don't have the resources to submit data, then I think we're doing a disservice to sustainability as well. So that's the balancing factor there.
Thank you, Duncan. Talking about interconnectivity, one question that has been sitting here for a few minutes, although it has 6 thumbs up. A question from Tobias. Thank you, Tobias. Has THE considered to address the systemic interrelate of SDGs, or will consider in the near future silo thinking for SDGs does not capture sustainability in a holistic way, though it is methodologically very demanding to capture a systemic perspective on the SDGs? Any thought on that?
So as I said, part of this, I think, is by using SDG 17 or things that we've put into there to underpin some of the others. So we have cheated slightly when we describe things as being part of SDG 17. The most notable one is that we took from SDG 4, if you go back to the actual UN documentation, 4.7 is about education for sustainability. And we took that out of SDG 4 and effectively put that reporting into our version of SDG 17 because education for sustainability is so core to the university mission around the SDGs that we thought it was something we wanted every university to report on. So I could see an evolution of this to say we actually almost split 17 into genuinely SDG 17 and the holistic elements. Those elements that we think are so core to universities' mission, so core to higher education, that they need to be the core interconnecting element of the ranking. At the moment, we're using SDG 17 as a placeholder for that. And I think there is a fair amount about the way that SDG 17 is defined and designed that actually that does make some sense. So I could see that being an extension of that. You're right, it is methodological. It's difficult to say that at this time of day. It is methodologically difficult to do that, but that doesn't mean it's impossible, and we should certainly look at that for the future.
Thank you very much. Maybe the next question, Christina?
Yes, we have a question from Göran Finnveden from KTH. Hi, Göran. This question is close to the question we had from Sylvia, and the question that you have raised is, a potential problem with the current methodology is that a higher education institution which is highly ranked could be absolutely terrible in an area which they don't submit data. A possible solution to this would be to include some compulsory questions on key areas, for example, working condition and climate action. What do your thoughts about this?
That is again an interesting question. If you talk to some people within the United Nations, for example, they would say that they would rather there was emphasis on certain aspects of the SDGs rather than others. And there is no doubt that the SDGs themselves are a compromise. It's hard to get 200 governments or 100, I think it's 172 governments from around the world to agree to something, particularly when you get into the detailed questions. But then the question is, what are the elements which are so important that we think they have to become compulsory? I think you could certainly make a case around the drive towards climate, to universities becoming carbon neutral. I think that's one of the ones where we could probably all agree that is such an overpowering and vital area that might be one example. But I think that the challenge is that you could make very good cases for almost everything else. The nature of the SDGs is that there aren't many SDGs where I look at them and think, why is this in here? Let's take some core examples. Gender equality. Could we really say that we didn't think gender equality was important enough to be one of those core questions? Or what about hunger? Even in wealthy parts of the world, we're seeing a huge issue in the UK at the moment about child hunger and child poverty. would we really say that we would take that out? And you end up in this very difficult question where the core questions become so many of them because you can't coherently argument. Another great example, modern slavery. I'm assuming all universities have a commitment to not having modern slavery. But again, how would we argue for not having that as one of the core elements? And this then becomes a very complex and large set of core elements that then almost becomes, a ranking in itself. So it's not that we don't think about these things. It's, I think, the practicalities of how do we end up in a situation where we don't then overburden universities in terms of the answers they have to provide. But I'm trying to answer this in a totally open way and say, I fully understand where you're coming from on this, and I totally get it. Practical ideas are always welcome, by the way.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Denmark. It is very time consuming to participate. Could it be a possibility not to collect data every year in a way more sustainable? It would be more sustainable not to use that time every year. So in the sense, a university doesn't change really much from one year to another.
Yes. So that would argue towards the model that Aishi have brought in, for example. So in the STARS system, you get your certification, and that is valid for a 3-year period. Now, I think that there are mechanical reasons why I want universities to submit every year. It's partly because we will change the questions as time goes by. I think this is an area where we want to be slightly more dynamic than in the world rankings. World rankings, the goal is punctured equilibrium, long periods of stability with changes. Here, it's, I think, more about evolution. As we find that universities are saying yes to a particular question all the time, we change the question to ask something that's deeper and more meaningful, more directed towards outcomes than outputs, and so on. But the practical reason, again, is around momentum. If we think that we want our universities to be committed towards Agenda 2030, we've got 10 years. That's an incredibly short period of time, especially for universities, because you're right, universities don't change nearly quickly enough in this particular instance. So I want to keep things moving. I want to keep the things progressing, and I think that part of that is an annual ranking, an annual thing. Now, some of your data may not change very quickly, in which case I hope that you reuse certain pieces of evidence to minimize the second and subsequent years of data submission. And hopefully within the data collection process, we're making that a little bit easier this year. And again, it's down to you to decide how often you want to submit. If you choose to submit only every 2 or 3 years, I would hope you would see the value in submitting every year. But if you choose to do it every 2 or 3 years, then that is a perfectly rational decision for your institution to take.
We have time for perhaps 2 more questions, and then, Dagan, if you agree, we'll take all the other questions and we'll gather them together with the questions of the morning, and we'll send them to you. Christina, would you like to take the next question, perhaps? Oh, you're muted, Christina.
Sorry. Now I'm unmuted. One question we have here is, I think having each university to submit a plan for enhancing their transparency and impact and contributions to the SDGs across teaching and research, and assessing them across 5 levels, like no SDG impact plan, weak plan, average plan, above average plan, and the SDG plan leader. That would be a great step forward. At the very least, it would encourage universities to start collecting, reporting, and considering SDGs related data. What do you think about this suggestion?
I think it's an interesting measure. I think it would be an interesting way to measure, and I don't think that this ranking is the only way that universities should be measuring things, and I think it's how we've decided to do this, and I think other routes might actually be very good and even potentially more successful, particularly within specific contexts. I would say, however, that if you were going to go down that route, you'd need to have a wealth of understanding of individual institutions and their contexts in order to be able to assess whether the plan was going to be an effective one or not. And that would require a lot of manual intervention and a lot of subjective decisioning. Having a plan is one thing. Having an effective or practical plan is very much a different thing. Having one that can be measured and that drives towards particular outcomes will depend on the context of in which the university is operating. And so I think that would be a really interesting approach, and it would be a very challenging one to undertake, but it's not a bad one. I think it's quite interesting.
Yes, and then we have a last question. Would you like to take that from Jean?
Yeah, the last question from UBC. Hi, Jen. On data accessibility, I'll read the question. 159 institutions received full point, 100% for the 17.4.1 commitment to the SDG education. But when I looked at some of the websites to see what they have done to investigate best practices, I rarely found any information. Part of the scoring is about public information. So can you help me understand why this might be, Duncan?
So this is an area where we want to dig deeper. I think it's the challenge here is that what we would really like to be able to do is explore what universities are practically doing around education for sustainability. But it's a very difficult thing because there is no one model for that. There are a number of initiatives that are starting up. There are some initiatives that are already in place, such as Sully Test, for example. There are other initiatives that are starting up. There is an organization in France that is setting up a certification scheme around education for sustainability. I think it's called Label Educ. And there are going to be others. But it is probably the weakest area in terms of the four aspects of sustainability that we look at. So we look at research, stewardship, outreach and teaching. Now, we can only take the evidence that we see. And if a university says that they're doing something, that starts off with, we say, yes, we will listen to that. It's also a judgment call about the degree to which something is genuinely being done by the university. So this is an area where I want to do more work in the future to actually get more differentiation there, to be able to understand much more clearly what universities are doing and to make sure that the evidence that they're providing is genuinely accessible. We are, however, I think, and this is a tangent from the ranking itself, we are putting together an initiative at Times Higher Education called THE Campus, which is looking to bring together educational material and pedagogical insights around learning particularly. And one of the areas that I hope they're going to be able to focus on is around teaching and learning around sustainability and pulling together good examples and good case studies from around the world. We're working with Arizona State University and Microsoft, amongst others, on that. And that will go live in a soft launch, I think, at the end of the year and more fully next year.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for all the answers. I will, Christina, would you like to conclude?
Yes, thank you so much, Alexander. First of all, I would like to thank all the participants and all the questions that you have sent to us. And of course, I will say a special thanks to Duncan, who have shared your knowledge and experience. And I think this has been a very good discussions together with you. And for us working with this right now, it's very useful to hear this in a very practical level also. And then I think it's so important what I have heard today is the willingness to share data. I think that is very important for us as university to make the data visible, transparent, and also that we publish the data. That is also one very important way to sharing. And we can do it despite if we are taking part in the ranking or not. I think that is very important. And then I think also it was very interesting to hear how you look in the future. And you are talking about input, output, and outcome. And that is something that we always struggle to think about, even when we are doing our internally following up about our sustainability work in KTH. So that is also something that I really would like to hear more about and how we can focus on that in the common ranking. And then also the friendly invitation that you also will have an advisor committee, because I think what we really would like to do as universities is to have the possibility to influence this ranking. And you are opening up for that. And I'm very glad for that. And one way is that you also are here today and having these two meetings for us. And then we're also looking in the future. It should be great to have a meeting with Elsevier and also discuss how we are working with the method that they are using and the keywords and so on. So I'm also looking forward to have such a meeting together with you and discuss that. And then I will also, of course, as a member in the ISCN network, continue to invite universities and to take part of the working group we have, where we are discussing the impact ranking and develop that together with other networks. We work closely together with CSAR that also have given us a lot of inspiration and understanding. So together we are stronger, and together we also can move this forwards to these very important sustainability challenges that we have in front of us. And of course, the universities have a very important role. So I think the next step will be also then to discuss later, and we will of course come back what kind of topics we would like to focus on. We had some great topics coming up here today that is new. It's about, of course, collecting and sharing data, the impact, it's about the input, output, and outcomes, and also the methodology that I hear that you really try to improve. So I would like to end there. Is there something that I have forgot, Alexander?
No, I just would like to emphasize, again, thank you, Duncan, for taking the time twice today for us. I think it was much appreciated. All your responses were really, really interesting. I have three maybe practical points for you all. This event has been recorded, so you can, it will be available on the ISCN website. Next Wednesday, we'll have a similar session with QS, so you're all welcome to join this session. And there will be a satisfaction survey at the end of this Zoom meeting. If you'd like to take half a minute to answer a few questions, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much to you all, and we're really looking forward to carrying on the collaboration.
Yes, and then I think also in the end we would like to also say thank you to ISCN and to Alfredo helping us putting up this session, all the technical issues, and also Silvia who's supporting us always. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.